Tonight, I'd like to give a shiur on a topic actually that's not spoken very often about. And over the years, people have asked me about the Mashiach ben Yosef. Who is he in the sense of not his identity, but what about him? He's obviously an individual that I've spoken extensively, and Rabbi also speaks extensively about the Mashiach ben Yosef. And there are many fascinating aspects of him. I mean, over the years I have spoken about him, different ideas, but there are many ideas which I have not spoken about. So I thought it would be interesting to talk about, obviously, a major figure in the redemption process, because that's really who Mashiach ben Yosef is. And to get an understanding, what does it take for Klal Yisrael to be redeemed, ultimately, And therefore, it behooves us in many ways to have a certain grasp of what are the events that are involved and need to be involved in order to bring about the redemption. Because obviously by the redemption, all of this goes away. And we are all zocha, not only to be redeemed, but to see the ultimate victory of Judaism over all the nations and religions of the world itself. So I thought it would be a very important topic to talk about, since what we are witnessing today in many ways is so spectacular. I mean, people look at what's happening today and they say, all these events, all these happenings can only be happening at the time which is very close to redemption. I mean, that's how insane a great deal of what's transpiring today. I mean, we've never seen the absurdities, the lack of common sense, the amount of stupidity and lunacy that we see today. We've never seen that. We're not talking here about a mistake or evil. We're talking about things that make no sense to any rational person. This whole concept of denying your gender, changing your gender, and so on, so many ideas that make absolutely no sense. And the complete capitulation to, like I said, absurdities in all forms of civilization and so on, So clearly one of the important ideas is the concept of Mashiach ben Yosef, what he has to go through. Let me just, before I begin, this year should be a blessing and a merit for the health and success of the families of Regina Bas Yosef Reuven and Yeshaya ben Yisrael ben Binyamin Wolf ben Tzvi Hirsch and Baruch ben Binyamin Wolf. And their neshama should, of course, have an aliyah. I also want to dedicate this shiur for Refuah Shlema for Esther Liba Bas Chaya Yafa. Right. She should have a complete Refuah Shlema. In any case, how do we begin to understand this? So there are certain ideas that you have to understand. The story that has a great mystery to it, obviously, is the story of Adam HaRishon and his wife Chava, and what really transpired. But there is an aspect of many aspects of the story which is critical, and one of it is the concept called the Eitz HaChaim, the tree of life, and the Eitz HaDas Tov Ra, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And of course they were real trees. But what they really do is they symbolize the avodah, or the approach that one can use to ultimately be attached to God. It's really what they are. They symbolize two different types of avodas, you see. And that has great bearing on us and on the entire, what's called trajectory of life. The Eitz HaChaim is a tree that obviously sustains eternal life. And what is interesting about the Eitz HaChaim, what is that, what avodah, what service to God does it symbolize? Well, originally, Adam did not have a Yetzer Hara, we know that. He certainly did not have any evil or Yetzer Hara within him, within his body. At most, there was a Satan in the mouthpiece of which was the Nachash, the primordial snake, and so on. But that snake in no way had any kind of force on Adam's body, whatever it was. So therefore, what was the avodah of Adam Rishon? Well, the avodah of Adam Rishon really is what's called the avodah of the Eitz HaChaim. And that is, there is basically, he experienced only good. And the avodah is, how fast would he maintain good? In other words, his objective was to grow in spirituality. And I'm being general, but whatever spirituality was in those days, that's his objective. What would be the rate of his growth? So the avodah was, well, you want it now. So of course it was expected that he would pursue whatever he had to pursue in terms of holiness and righteousness. He would pursue it with tremendous speed. And therefore, the blockage of that, of the rate of ascent, so to speak, would be the avodah, the challenge that he faced. But there was no challenge of any kind of a blockage to get to holiness or to get to righteousness. There was no block. In other words, there was no Yetzer Hara. There was no opposing force. There was no opposing ideologies. It was God, and that's really all there was, you see. So the question was, he knew he wasn't perfect. How fast would he go? But then God said, I want you to do, that's the avodah that I want you to do. This is the work that you have to do, the challenge. But there's another tree in the garden, and that tree will give you a knowledge, what he called good and evil. That's a whole different set of circumstances, and I don't want you to eat that. Because if you eat that, you will have imbibed the concept of evil, and it will become part of you. Not only that, but your avodah, your operation will be very different. Your challenges will be very different. Now, when it says Eitz Hadas, it doesn't say Eitz Hadas Ra, the knowledge of evil. No, it says Eitz Hadas Toiv Ra. What does that mean? Well, Toiv represents your spiritual aspect. The good part of you. What is that? That's your neshama. So you're going to maintain that characteristic of righteousness, or the ability to perceive and understand what is the correct path, the path of holiness, or the desire of holiness, So that will be maintained. I'm not removing that, you see, but there will be a new impediment, a new block, and therefore a new challenge. And that challenge is evil. That is actually an opposing ideology, an opposing force that you could actually feel, that in some way wants you to skip the good and just to do what you want, you see. So the concept of Toiv, which is the concept of the neshama, is the feeling that you want to be part of God, and that's the direction you want to take. The concept of evil really is a concept of self-realization. You want to do what you want. Forget about what God wants. you want to exercise your will. That's really what the Ra is, you know. Even though it sounds very simple, it really is. The Yetzer Hara is interested in only one thing. It's not that he wants us to sin, because basically every sin is an expression of self. I want to do what I want to do. I don't have any boss. Nobody's going to tell me what to do. You see? And therefore that is the conflict. Do I follow God's dictates, or do I do what I want to do? Because I believe that I also exist independent of God. This really is the root, is the basic plan of what the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra wants. It's you versus God, you see. Whereas the Eitz HaChaim symbolized God and only God. And the question is, to what extent or how fast will you engage in that direction? But the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra introduces a whole new set of circumstances where you now get involved in what's called the algorithm, to use a computer term and so on. You are now part of the equation. You see, to what extent will you give up your desires, your will, or your need to express self, right, and go toward God? And to what extent will you have the illusion that you are somebody? It's a whole different bechina. In other words, it's an entire different avodah. And that's really what the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra is, where man has to pit himself against a force that wants to convince us that we are the pivot, we are the crown of the world, and therefore we can do whatever we want. You know, obviously this theme of a new direction of man, new challenges of man, you can obviously talk a great deal about this. It's the whole concept of what's called the Yetzer Hara, the evil tempter, the Sitra Achra, the other side. But that's basically what it really is. The concept of self, the individual, versus God, you know, and so on. And who has the real dominance, and who is the real meaning of existence, and so on. Anyway, I just want to introduce the two different paths, you see, to God. One does not have an obstacle, but it does have, you know, challenges in terms of the speed. And the other one has real obstacles, and so on, and so on. And those are really very important ideas, these two avodas, or these two, and so on. And therefore, there's a Chazal, it's really a Gemara, that says, and we begin to understand, it says, Lefum tsaro agro. According to the tsar, the pain, agro is the reward. In other words, what determines your reward is not just the mitzvah itself, but what it also is, what do you have to give up to do the mitzvah? You see, Lefum tsaro, according to the pain of what? Of self-denial, right? Where you have to suspend and put aside your will, your desires, right? And only do what God wants. That's the tsar, and it is not easy. And we see it's not easy because so many people, in many ways, fail, and so on, you know, each to his own extent. But agro, that's the reward. Because in the end, that's the task. To what extent will you put aside yourself and recognize that the only meaning in life is a direction that leads to God's will? That's really that's the gist really of the entire Veda, you see. So in the beginning, when Adam did not have, or he didn't eat the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra, you know, he didn't have this tsar of giving up self. There was no real self-denial of force that stopped him from pursuing God. No, he always pursued God. The question is, to what extent? We see that even today among religious people. To what extent do they desire the belief in God, the bitachon, the trust, the mitzvahs, the pursuit of the mitzvahs, and so on? But after Adam ate from that tree, there was a new challenge, and that is you need to deny self, right? You need to put aside and realize that the only being that exists and therefore is entitled to observe that will is God. He is responsible for everything. So that's a very important idea. Now, I have said many times, that there's a lot of different ways. There's the mitzvahs, obviously, to do the mitzvahs, which is basically the will of God. These are specific commandments. But what's most important is not just the commandments, is the fact that whenever you do a mitzvah, you are expressing a statement that His will is dominant. And that itself expresses another statement. Well, if His will is dominant, it's because He's the only being really that exists. And therefore, obviously, I have to do His will. So that's really what you're doing when you do a mitzvah. It's the ultimate understanding that the only thing that really exists is God. Now, we also know that if a person doesn't do the will of God, then he has what's called tshuva. He repents and so on. And that itself has a series of actions that he takes. When you do tshuva, you obviously regret what you thought, your belief, that it's not you that's important, it is God, because that's what repentance really is. Also, when you do repent, you deny yourself the pleasure of doing the sin again. So that's an undoing of the illegal pleasure, if you want to use that word, right, that you've done by doing the sin. So that's the second thing that you accomplish, and that is to undo the pleasure that you had. A third idea of pain, and I'm giving you what's involved, why pain is what's called a device that brings you closer to God. Because one of the things that God requires, and we don't really know why, but one of the things that He requires is that God has a fundamental character trait, if you want to call that word, character trait, and that is He's a true cause. That means God actually causes something to happen, and without Him doing it, it wouldn't have happened. Well, what God wants us is to cause the future world, right? And that is, in many ways, a characteristic that only God has. Cause, true cause, and so on. So when you repent, right, so you are now causing a change of mind, and that is godlike, to be able to actually cause. God doesn't force you to do tshuva, repent, you do that. But that means it's a change of mindset. You become a cause for the opposite way of believing and so on. In any case, now we know that there's a third way of approaching God, and that is suffering, and so on, that if a person suffers, that is also a way of atonement, and specifically it's atonement for those, again, reasons, because you deny yourself the pleasure. When you suffer, you obviously deny the pleasure, you're not having pleasure, and when you do suffer, as a result of that, you are actually causing, right? Actually, you're suffering. So you actually, like I said, feel the pain of not experiencing the pleasure of a sin and so on, Also, it's a tremendous statement that you're a nobody. Because if you were really somebody, why don't you stop the pain? Why don't you stop the suffering? Which you obviously can't. So suffering itself is a proof that you're basically a nobody. And as a result of that, hopefully, you're going to have a different mindset and so on. Now, so those are some of the important ideas that you have to know. Now, to get into the idea of Mashiach, you have to understand there's a certain type of character, or I should say a group of people. They're called the Sovlei Chayloim. Sovlei Chayloim means they suffer illnesses. But they suffer illnesses not for their own sake. They suffer the illness and they take part in alleviating the suffering of the Jewish people, right? They suffer for other people, you see. Now it's not clear how that works really, because their suffering was have to do with the other guy. He's not suffering. But because the Jews are really one entity of which we don't really understand, there is a mechanism, a way of one person or being to suffer for another being, since that being itself is really one with you. Now we don't really have a clear understanding, but people who take on this suffering for others to alleviate the magnitude of suffering of others, they are called the Sovlei Choloim, those who suffer illnesses, right, for the sake of others. And guess what? They actually bring atonement to other people by their suffering. Very important concept. Okay. Now, one of the conditions of being that member of that group, okay, there is a condition that you cannot deserve the suffering on your own, because why would it go for somebody else? It already has to go for you. You see, so we're talking about very righteous people, you see, that suffer, but they suffer for others. And they can only do so because they really have a very minimal amount to suffer for their own sins. So really they have to be tzaddikim, you see. And we see that when you see an extremely righteous person suffering, then he's probably part of the group of Sovlei Choloim. Now what's interesting is that when you do suffer for others, the reward is infinite. We cannot even begin to fathom the amount of reward a person will have in order to alleviate the sufferings of the Jewish people. We can't. It's beyond our comprehension. But it's safe to say that the reward is literally infinite, you see. And they have a name called Yisurin Shel Avo, sufferings of love, you see. Now what is interesting is a person that has to want to suffer. He has to accept it willingly. If he doesn't want it, it has to go away. Right, that's the deal, so to speak, you know. We find that in the Gemara, for instance, Masechta Brachos, where Rabbi Yochanan, where there was one of the Amoraim, I think it was Rabbi Eliezer or Elazar, whatever, and he was suffering and so on. So Rabbi Yochanan, the great Rabbi Yochanan, one of the greatest of Amoraim, you know, he visited him because he was suffering, and this Rabbi Eliezer or Elazar, and he said, so they were talking about the suffering of this person. So Rabbi Yochanan said, you know, he wanted to alleviate whatever, and he was talking in those terms. So finally, he said to Rabbi Elazar, do you want these sufferings? So he said, no. And he says, I don't want them, and I don't want their reward. Now obviously, what do you mean their reward? There is no reward for suffering. It's an undoing of sin. But obviously this was Yisurin Shel Avo, you see, or Sovlei Choloim, he was part of that. So he said, no, I don't want them or the reward. So Rabbi Yochanan, however he did it, removed them. I mean, they were extraordinarily great people, and they had that ability and so on. So he removed it. So it's called Yisurin Shel Avo. Now what is interesting is that this Sovlei Choloim, these group of people that suffer for the Jewish people, right, they are sprinkled throughout the generations. Because Jews, in many ways, cannot sustain the amount of suffering or the sins that go on in the generation. And they need help. It's called an assist, right? And that's the assist of the Sovlei Choloim. The greatest of the Sovlei Choloim that the Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto certainly brings down is Moshe Rabbeinu, which is strange, and the two Mashiachim, two Messiahs, Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David, right? They are the top of the list, you see. So, many people can say, well, what do you mean Moshe Rabbeinu suffers? He's long gone. No. One of the ideas which is important, why is Moshe Rabbeinu buried outside of Eretz Yisrael? You don't realize, for somebody to be buried outside of Eretz Yisrael is a suffering of the neshama, because they want to access the Shekhinah. And the greatest amount of Shekhinah can be accessed when you are in Eretz Yisrael. Right, that's why it's so incredible to live in Eretz Yisrael. You see, and that is among the greatest places to access the Shekhinah, and so on. So Moshe Rabbeinu was buried outside the land of Israel, and that's what God said, don't talk about this anymore. The reason for that is that Moshe Rabbeinu's neshama suffers, right? Because he's not buried in Eretz Yisrael, which means that in a certain sense, he doesn't have access to the Rasham that is appropriate for his level of who he was, which is incredible. You see? So Moshe Rabbeinu is part of the Sovli Choloim. But besides that, there's also the two Mashiachim, right? So I want to talk a little about the sufferings of the Mashiach ben Yosef, which to a certain extent includes Mashiach ben David, but the one who apparently suffers much more is the Mashiach ben Yosef. You see, yeah. Now I had mentioned last week, or last 2 weeks, where do we see this? I mentioned this, the Yalkut Shimoni, right? I think in 499 in Yeshayahu, and I mentioned this a while back several times. This is where we see it. You see, that God said at the end of time, he said to Mashiach ben Yosef at the beginning of time, right? That in the end of time, your children, means Klal Yisrael, Jewish people, will not make it. They're going to all perish. You see, that's what he says. Now, obviously, God doesn't mean everybody, but there is a certain percentage of Klal Yisrael that won't make it. You see, because their sins are too great. And God knows the exact measure of what that means. This is what he says to Mashiach ben Yosef. So Mashiach ben Yosef says to God, wait a minute, I would like to take on, here we go, it's a Sovli Choloim. I would like to take on the sufferings that is needed to expiate, to atone for the Jewish people, right? This is what he says, right? But not only everybody who lives in my generation, but every Jew that ever lived, I will accept upon myself the sufferings of these people in order to allow them to enter Gan Eden and so on, and of course the future world. That means he voluntarily, which is the way it is, accepted to suffer for the Jewish people. Sovli Choloim. That's the classic Medrash, where we see all of a sudden Mashiach ben Yosef now begins the Parsha, as they say, the journey of being one of the greatest of the Sovli Choloim. Because look what he said, take on everybody's necessity of atonement. I mean, it's amazing. Did he have any idea what that means? Anyway, the Medrash says that God said, okay. Of course, the reason why God said that, because he wanted Mashiach ben Yosef to accept the suffering, you see. And fortunately for us, he did. So then it says that God took an oil basel, a yoke of iron, and he put it on top of him. It's like you ever see these yokes on top of oxen? That's what he did, which makes sense because Mashiach ben Yosef's symbol is an ox, and so on. Anyway, so Mashiach ben Yosef bowed his head because it was enormous weight, and therefore the suffering of Mashiach ben Yosef was terrible, and he screamed out, I can't tolerate this. I'm only a person, bas of Adam. I'm only flesh and blood. So how can I possibly take this? So God said to him, yes, but you said you would, because God needs somebody to accept the sufferings that's missing from Klal Yisrael. So God says to the Mashiach, I too will go and suffer. God doesn't suffer, obviously, but I am going to voluntarily allow, right, my glory and my majesty to be concealed. And that is the tzar of the Shekhinah. We don't realize, but God, so to speak, it's not, of course, it's not the real suffering, but the will of God wants to express or reveal who He is. That is the will of God. And that's what every angel sees, who is God in heaven. We, of course, don't. That's the will of God. So when God has to voluntarily say, I'm going to conceal who I really am, which is a being which is beyond comprehension, that is called Shchinto B'Galusa. The divine presence is in exile. And that kaviyochel, as they say, as one could say, is unbelievable pain. And that's really what the concept of the tzar of the Shekhinah. What tzar of the Shekhinah? You know, when people get up, there's a thing called Tikkun Chatzos, where there are prayers to be said at midnight, and so on. And there are people that say this Tikkun Chatzos. Many tzaddikim say this, and so on. And this is for the pain of the Shekhinah, the divine presence in Golus, in exile. What exile? What divine presence in exile? This is it, where God cannot reveal. He voluntarily submits to being concealed, and that is against His will, really. So He says to Mashiach ben Yosef, I will conceal myself. Okay, I will accept what is, to me, so to speak, suffering, in order to help you, to show you that I am in the same state, right, of denial, and so on. So therefore the Mashiach ben Yosef says, okay, then if you're going to do that, then I will be able to bear my own suffering. It's a very important concept, you see. So we now understand a very important idea, that the Mashiach ben Yosef really in many ways is the greatest of the Sovli Chiloim, those people that bear the suffering for the iniquity of the Jewish people. That's what we see. But we can ask ourselves, what does that mean? So Rabbi Chaim Luzzatto says something very interesting. You know, he says this in the Sefer called Kinnis Hashem Tzavokas, you know, which he wrote against the false Messiah, Shabtai Tzvi. But in any case, in section 2, toward the end actually, he said there's a difference. Mashiach ben David also suffers by being denied the proper closeness or attachment to God, but that suffering is the neshama of the Mashiach ben David. But Mashiach ben Yosef, he says, he suffers as a person, right? That there's a real person that is born, and he lives amongst us, so to speak, right? And he goes through tremendous suffering. See, that's a tremendous difference between the two types of sufferings, although they both suffer, because you can suffer even as a neshama by being denied that type of greatness that you really deserve because of your acts and in terms of who you are and so on, you see. In any case, so that's the difference. So the question we have to ask, wait a minute, if that's the case, then what does it mean that he suffers? Sheikh ben Yosef, and so on, even as a real person, you see. Well, one of the ideas which is very important, which I think I had mentioned a long time ago, right, is what are the weapons of the Mashiach ben Yosef? And there is a pasuk at the end of the Chumash where it says, B'chor Shoroi, the firstborn of his ox. These are the blessings that Moshe Rabbeinu gave the Shvatim, the tribes. And the one he gave Shevet Yosef, okay, is the following. B'chor Shoroi, the firstborn of his ox, Hodoloi, beauty is his. V'kani Re'im Karnov, now he calls it a B'chor Shoroi, the firstborn of his ox. So he says that the horns of this animal, this cow, or ox I should say, right, Hodoloi, right, but the horns are the horns of a ram. It's like, not the horns of an ox. And then it says, Ubehem, and with these horns, Ami min Nagach, he will gore the nations. That's what it says. Now obviously that's a metaphor that represents something else. So what it really represents is the following. B'chol Shiur, who's the firstborn of the ox? That is the tribe of Yosef. It's Mashiach ben Yosef. Okay? Hodoloi. He's beautiful. He has a tremendous look of enormous beauty. Wherein does the beauty lie? Right? And the answer is the Kani Re'im. He doesn't have the horns of an ox, which is what? Which is short, very powerful, because the ox in general has very powerful shoulders and so on. But it's the horns of a Re'im. If you ever take a look at some goats, some of their horns are magnificent. The symmetry, the way they're shaped and so on. You know, there's many creatures that have beautiful looking horns. In fact, people cut them off. They put them on their wall as trophies and so on. You see? So the pasuk says that the horns of this ox, Mashiach ben Yosef, is what? Is the horns of a ram. And Hodoloi, it's beautiful to look at. And with these horns, he will gore the nations. Well, that's obviously a metaphor. What does it refer to? What are horns? Horns is weapons. That's what it's used for, that emanate from the head. Well, that tells us that the weapons of the Mashiach ben Yosef is chokhmah, wisdom. This is the hallmark of the Mashiach ben Yosef. Unparalleled chokhmah, wisdom. And it emanates from his head, which is the wisdom that emanates from his head is unbelievably powerful, and it's like a certain type of ore, light, and with this light he will gore the nations. The nations will be astonished at this wisdom. That is the weapons of the Mashiach ben Yosef. His chokhmah, his ability to know secrets, you see, of which is not known by people, certainly by Jewish people, and so on. Tremendous amount of knowledge and so on. That's called the Kani Re'im, the horns of the Re'im. Right. That's his weapons. And that in many ways is not only that, but it's that wisdom, that insight, spectacular understanding that is beyond our understanding. And by the way, that is the Messianic light, right? He has that wisdom. And that comes from the fact, right, Mashiach ben Yosef, because that is the weapons of the Mashiach, right? And so on. You see, that's why, where does that wisdom come from? That wisdom, I really should tell you, I once said this a long time ago. Adam Rishon, or all of us, have 5 parts to the neshama, right? We go from the bottom, nefesh, then we go, the next part of the neshama is ruach, and then the third part going up is neshama, which is a individual part. Then there's what's called the chaya, right? And then there's what's called the yechida. Now each part is associated with some area of the body. The nefesh is in the liver, the ruach is in the heart, the neshama is in the brain, the chaya surrounds the body like an aura, and the yechida is not in any way attached to the body. It is the link between you and the Shekhinah, right? That's what it is. That is your concept of the Rabbanu Shalom, the yechida itself, which means the unique one, and so on. Okay. Obviously, Adam Rishon, his neshama was what's called a collective neshama. Everybody, neshama comes from Adam Rishon. So as a collective, he had everybody's neshama, nefesh, ruach, neshama, chayin, yechida. You see, when Adam sinned, right, so what entered in him was zoyama, so it contaminated all 4 parts of the neshama, except the yechida. The yechida was able to fly away away from Adam before the Zoyama of the Satan, the pollution of the Satan, can taint or contaminate the Yechidah. So it's amazing, the Yechidah, which by the way is the collective Yechidah of all Jews, because he had the collective neshama of every Jew, you see. So that was able to fly away, and it is the only thing in creation that was not contaminated at all by the Zoyama of the Satan. That Yechidah was not contaminated, as I say, and is the collective. And it is that Yechidah that links up to the Shekhinah, to the highest spheres, and is able to take the wisdom of the divine presence. That is the Or Mashiach. The wisdom that is contained in this Yechidah, which was never contaminated, right, is the link between all Jews and God. And it is through that link, like a cable, so to speak, right, that can receive the unbelievable divine wisdom, right? You see, therefore, at the end of time, Mashiach ben Yosef, okay, consists of several neshamas. What does that mean? In every generation, there is always a neshama of Mashiach ben Yosef. What does that mean? That means the shirish, the neshama of the Mashiach, is what's called, he has a yisoid, he has a foundational neshama, okay, and then that foundational neshama gives rise to what's called a spark, a shirish, you see, and that shirish connects to the real Mashiach, Yechidah. In every generation, there's always those two things, right? In other words, let's be more specific. The Shirish Neshama of the Mashiach ben Yosef was Yosef HaTzadik. I should say the Yisoid. He enters the generation of the Mashiach himself, right? What does that mean? That means in every generation there is some type of neshama called a shirish, a root, and that enters a person, and he, if the generation is worthy, can become Mashiach ben Yosef. But that's only because he has a shirish. He has to be a candidate, okay? But if he does become Mashiach ben Yosef, then he is joined with the neshama of Yosef HaTzadik. So within him you now have not only the shirish, which makes him a candidate, but he also has, right, the Yisoid neshama of Yosef HaTzadik. Then, but he's still not Mashiach. Then if he becomes Mashiach in that generation, really becomes Mashiach, because that's the generation that Mashiach comes, then the Yechidah, by the way, that Yechidah of Adam Harishon, which originally left Adam, and it's the only aspect of the neshama that was never contaminated, split when it left Adam. So one half of that Yechidah goes into this person who will become Mashiach, that half Yechidah of Adam Rishon, and joins with these other parts. And that's what makes a Mashiach. It's the Yechidah of one half of the Yechidah of Adam Rishon that joins together, you see, with the Yisoid, which is Yosef HaTzadik, and the Shirish, okay, then he becomes Mashiach. And the same thing what happens with Mashiach ben David. The Shirish, the Yisoid Neshama of David is Yehuda, which eventually becomes David HaMelech, obviously, is David HaMelech. And therefore, he also has, in every generation, there has to be somebody who is a candidate to be Mashiach ben David, just like Mashiach ben Yosef. And in the generation that he is assigned to be the Mashiach, then he will have David HaMelech join the actual neshama of the David HaMelech. The Yisoid becomes a foundational neshama. It will join together with the Shirish. But what will happen is the other half of the Yechidah of Adam Rishon will now join that, three parts, right? and he now becomes the Mashiach ben David. Now, why do they need a Yechida? Because the Yechida is the entry to the divine presence, to the Shekhinah. And that's what brings down this unbelievable awe, insight of the Messianic light. See, that's how they do it. Because they are given the Yechida in order to access the divine presence. And therefore, all of us, since the Yechida of Adam Rishon was a collective Yechida of all Jews, that means when the Mashiach ben David or ben Yosef has the Yechida of Adam Rishon, then all of us will experience the O Mashiach, right? Because he's got our Yechida, and he becomes the what's called the conduit of everybody now activating their own Yechida, even though it's on ben David and ben Yosef, and we now experience the Orishon, right? That's basically how it happens, you see. So therefore, as a result of that, this can only happen because of the Chokhmah of ben David and ben Yosef. Sheikh ben Yosef, the horns of the Re'im, they are really the Yechida of the Adam HaRishon. I'm trying to give you an understanding of what the mechanics is and so on, you see. Now, what is interesting to what I'm describing, so we now understand that the Orishon, which is the Yechid of Adam HaRishon, let's say we're talking now about Mashiach ben Yosef, not ben David, right? You now understand he is the Neshama of Yosef HaTzadik, he's the Shirish of that aspect, right? That can be a candidate for Mashiach ben Yosef, and if that generation deserves Mashiach ben Yosef, then Yechid of Adam HaRishon now joins together with him, and that is the conduit that allows the divine presence of Shekhinah to make its way down into the Yechida of all Jewish people. You see, and what's interesting is we see that in the Akedah. The Akedah is Meramis that. The Akedah was a very strange event. I've talked about that. But one of the things that I want to mention is this, is he was about to do what? Shecht, slaughter, right? Yitzchak, which was incredible. Avraham Avinu was about to listen to the command of God and shecht, slaughter Yitzchak. But he didn't, because the Malach stayed his hand. In any case, and then it says, but before he was about to do that, there was a ram, an ayil, apparently that was caught. Nechaz basvach, it was entangled, and Rashi says by its horns in a bush, you see, and it couldn't get to Avram. So all of a sudden, when Avram stopped doing what he was going to do, which means to shecht, to slaughter Yitzchak, that ram broke free from its entanglement with its horns in the bush. What is that ram? So it's brought down, I think Rashi says this, that ram was there from 2,000 years ago, waiting for the Akedah. And it says that that ram was offered Tachas Benoi instead of Yitzchak, which means that at the end of time, and that's when the Akedah is the last test, at the end of time, the Jews were not going to be making it. That's exactly what God said. You see, that the Jews won't make it, and you need the suffering of Mashiach ben Yosef to do it. But we now understand, if the Mashiach ben Yosef suffers, how? And the answer is, it has to be through his horns, which is his wisdom, that he cannot express his wisdom. And that is why that ram was entangled with his horns, waiting for 2,000 years, right? And that was his suffering, you see. And it was Tachas Benoi, that's what the Pasuk says, right? That instead of Yitzchak, the ram was offered instead. But that means if it was also offered instead, that Yitzchak really deserved to die, which means that Klal Yisrael really should not have made it, whatever. So this ram is sitting there, whatever, entangled in his bush with his horns for 2,000 years. This is what the Medrash says, and so on. Who is that ram? And the answer is Mashiach ben Yosef. And it's entangled in its horns, which is its Kani Re'im. You see? And that's how we see what the suffering of the Mashiach ben Yosef is. And that its inability, tremendous inability to express his Chokhmah. Now you may say, wait a minute, is there any other place that we see this? Because what I'm doing is telling you about allusions to this. The Akedah, the ram entangled in its horns, the Kani Re'im, right? The horns of the ram, by the blessing by Moshe Rabbeinu of the Shevet of Yosef, and so on, you know? And this is what I'm saying, and that the Mashiach ben Yosef suffers, and the answer is yes, there is. There's somebody who actually says this openly. In fact, I've never seen this anywhere else except in this Sefer. This Sefer, the name of the Sefer is called, and you can look it up actually, it's called Neflois HaYehudi, the wonders of the Yehudi. Now there was a very great Hasidic Rebbe called the Yehudi HaKodesh. Famous, very famous. He was obviously a very holy person. The Yehudi HaKodesh, the holy Jew, which is obviously what they call him, you know. He was the Rebbe of many Hasidic Rebbes after him, the Yehudi HaKodesh and so on, right? And he was part of the Hasidus of the Baal Shem Tov and so on. Anyway, he wrote a sefer called Neflois HaYehudi. And one of the pieces in that sefer, he says something which is incredible. He actually described, the Yehudi HaKodesh describes the suffering of the Mashiach ben Yosef. Now we already have an idea of what that is. That there's something wrong with his ability to fathom information, thinking, chokhmah, that he suffers from his inability to reach incredible insights. But here's the problem, is that when he's having that difficulty or that blockage, he has the shirish of Mashiach ben Yosef. Can you imagine the pain of a person that has this incredible potential of wisdom, that he very hard to think, and here's the way he describes it. Let me tell you what he says. He says the Mashiach ben Yosef is a person that he sits down to learn, let's say Sunday, right? He sits down to learn Torah, right? On Monday, so let's assume he covers a certain amount of information. So on Monday, right, he forgets basically everything he learned on Sunday. So he's got to start all over again on Monday. On Tuesday, right, he sits down to learn, because remember, he is the shirish, root soul of Mashiach ben Yosef. He has unbelievable spiritual potential, and he forgets what he learned on Sunday and Monday. So you got to relearn it. And this happens all the time, for years. So clearly what we're witnessing here is an inability to learn. Yet he has the neshama, or the shirish of Mashiach ben Yosef. Can we begin to imagine his pain? Can you imagine, I'll give you just an example. Imagine a person of the capacity of the Vilna Gaon, right? And he's got this incredible head, obviously. I mean, the Vilna Gaon was really, you know, his ability to think was off the charts. I'm not even talking about his photographic memory. It's just his speed of thinking and his ability to access unbelievable information and insights and so on. Could you imagine if all of a sudden he's struck with some type of altering disease that blocks him from thinking, you see? Or he has real memory problems, which is very possible today, especially today with cognitive science, you know. Could you imagine a person of that nature, of that potential, not able to learn, yet he's still the Vilna Gaon in terms of his spiritual capacity, right? And his spiritual abilities? No, you cannot even imagine. And imagine if he had to endure that for decades. What would he look like when he's 70 years old? He'd be a basket case. It's obvious. How can a person possibly endure with that level of neshama and that ability to know, to think, and so on, to learn, to achieve tremendous Torah knowledge, that he's completely blocked? Now that doesn't mean he's an Amoritz, no, because there is probably some information that does remain with him, and there is a very slow accumulation. But we're talking about the Vilna Gaon, who, he once took on, just to tell you what this person was, famous story, when I think he was 12 years old. So he took on a vow to finish Menachos, Zvachim and Menachos, each one over 100 plot of Kachim. He took on a vow to finish it for that year. Anyway, by Simchas Torah. Anyway, it was the night of Simchas Torah, and for some reason, he wasn't able even to start those two Masechtas, which are very difficult Masechtas. They are filled with unbelievable amount of facts, right? About Kachim, about the Beis HaMikdash and the sacrifices. And he hadn't even started it. And it was the night of Simchas Torah. And he had to finish it by the next day, right? So, I forgot who it was, but somebody walked into that room that he was there. So he started learning it that night. This is the Vilna Gaon, as a 12-year-old kid. So he sees the Vilna Gaon looking at Gemara, Zvachim Menachos, and he's just going like that. He just turns the page after page. So he couldn't believe what he was seeing. I forgot who it was. It was a big Adam Gadol. So he goes over to he figured this is impossible. So he goes over to the kid, the Vilna Gaon, as a 12-year-old, and he says, "What are you doing?" So the Vilna Gaon says to him, "Well, I took on this vow that I have to learn Zvachim and Menachos, each one over 100 plot and so on, of Kachim, of sacrifices and so on. I have to finish it by tomorrow." So he looks at him and says, "Finish it by tomorrow? Excuse me, what are you doing? You look like you're turning the pages." So the Vilna Gaon says, "Well, not really. I know it." So he says to him, whoever there was, "Can I ask you some questions?" Wanted to see. He said, the Vilna Gaon said, "Yeah." So he began to ask him on Zvachim and Menachos, and he knew everything, which is astounding. He was able to. So he saw, who am I dealing with? This is not normal or ordinary, right? And that shows you what he was at 12. Obviously had a phenomenal memory and so on, but he was able to understand it with lightning speed, so he saw that this kid is extraordinary. So he left the room. He said, "Look, I don't want to disturb this guy." And guess what? The Vilna Gaon at 12 years old finished Zvachim and Menachos, right, by Simchas Torah in the morning. Now, that person, think about that. Think about that person with this potential, all of a sudden is blocked, that he keeps forgetting. Forget about photographic memory. He keeps forgetting, right, what he learned again and again, right? But he's the Vilna Gaon. He has that type of neshama, of unbelievable capacity for greatness. This is what the Mashiach ben Yosef goes through. Now, I don't know what the capacity of Mashiach ben Yosef is, but it has to be extraordinary enough, right, where this will give him unbelievable pain, obviously, or else what's the whole point, right? So this is what the Neflois HaYehudi says. You see, now why? Not only we can begin to understand what this man goes through, that he can't learn, and he's always forgetting, and any of his chidushim is forgotten. I mean, could you imagine the frustration? It's terrible, and he has to go through this year after year, because that's how long it takes to undo all the suffering of the Jews for thousands of years. Now, one thing I'd like to answer, well, okay, I understand the pain is incredible, but why this type? And the answer is because that is the specialty of the Mashiach ben Yosef, is the horns of the Re'im. That is his specialty. That's what separates him from everybody else, his incredible capacity to learn. But why does it atone? And the answer is because one of the greatest things that Klal Yisrael omits is Bittul Torah, right? This is an undoing of the chet, of not really learning enough Torah. So when you learn and you can't figure it out, right? That's pain that you have, that I can't figure it out, I don't understand, atones for your Bittul Torah, from the fact that you have not learned Torah, because you want it so much, right? But it's not happening. So that's an undoing of the fact that you could have learned, didn't. So this is an undoing. You'll want to learn and you can't. You see, that's why in many ways it is a bittul, it's an undoing kapora for all the Torah that we could have learned. And I'm sure we all could have learned more than we learned so on, right? And that's the greatest of the chatoim, is that we're not engaged in the Torah the way we should have. So that explains the nature of that particular kind of yisurin, or suffering. But this is incredible when you think about that here's a person that has to undergo something which is completely against his nature, which is unbelievable, right? In order to help the Jewish people, and he is the Sovlei Choiloim. But that is punishment or suffering number one. Guess what? There's more to come. There's more suffering, because, and I don't know if it will take too long, so I have to do it next week or next whatever, part 2. There's something else that he has, Mashiach ben Yosef, because the Mashiach ben Yosef not only has the capacity to know, to learn ideas at the highest level, but what he also has the capacity is his ruchnius, his dveikus. Could you imagine the kedusha, the holiness of this Mashiach ben Yosef? Imagine, and I'll just let you imagine. Imagine a person who has unbelievable koyach, capacity for righteousness, for kedusha. I mean, just think of any of the great rebbes, right? And their capacity for spirituality, right? And then imagine all of a sudden they are blocked from even approaching a millimeter of that kedusha. So you're going to say to me, how in the world does that happen, right? Believe me, it can happen in man's, health and so on. People go through all kinds of trials and tribulations where they are forced in many ways, and I'll say the word, to sin, right? And I will show you what all this means. That all of a sudden, Mashiach ben Yosef is not only blocked with his capacity to be a tremendous goyin in learning and so on, because that's what he's supposed to do for the Jewish people, but he's blocked in his ability to be an incredible, not only tzaddik, but kodosh, holy person, which means dveikus, to be close to God. Yet there's something in him, you can look at it as a phenomenal Yetzer Hara. Maybe I'll just give you one example to show you the beginning of what all this means and so on, Yehuda and Tamar, the famous story in Parshas Vayeshev. Yehuda, he was among the greatest of the Shvatim, right? If not for Yosef, who was greater, Yehuda was the top. Yehuda, the Shevet Yehuda, right? Anyway, so Yehuda had 2 sons, Er and Oinam, and he gave one of them to a girl, right? A woman, Tamar, right? So whatever reason, he died. So there was a concept called Yibum, without getting into that. So Er now married Tamar in order to give a name to his brother, maintain, perpetuate the name of his brother. And then he died. So here's Tamar, who's a widowed twice, right? And in those days, in the time of Yehuda, before the Torah was given, anybody could fulfill that ability, even Yehuda, who was her father-in-law, you see? And she wanted to be with Yehuda. She wanted to marry him, and he was allowed to marry her, and so on, you see? So what happened? So Yehuda, the Torah in Parshas Vayeshev says that he was on his way, journeying somewhere, and all of a sudden, Tamar, who disguised herself, basically, forgive my expression, as a prostitute, on the way, and she set up her tent to lure men in, whatever. But obviously, she was a very righteous woman, and she knew Yehuda was going to pass by, and she was going to lure Yehuda into having relations with her, right? And Yehuda, of course, went by, and of course Yehuda was going to go by. That's not what Yehuda is all about, right? We're talking about one of the Shvatim, one of the greatest of the Shvatim. So the Medrash says an incredible thing, that a God all of a sudden spoke to the angel, right, of Taiva, right, especially with women, right? And he said to the angel, fire up. You need to take away his free will. That Yehuda must be together with Tamar. And I will explain next week and so on. So Yehuda had no free will. Had no free will. Obviously it's possible, which I will explain next time and so on, you know. So Yehuda went into the tent and he lived with her, you see. And then they had children and so on, you know. Now, did Yehuda ever find out? He did. How? Because she became pregnant from Yehuda. And he knew that his sons were dead. Who in the world did she stay with? Right? With somebody, which was obviously forbidden, and they were going to take her out and kill her for whatever infidelity at that time and so on. So all of a sudden, she produced signs that Yehuda had given her as a mashkain, as a what do you call it? As a payment in kind until he could pay her or whatever and so on. So all of a sudden it says he realized, wait a minute, I'm the one that impregnated her. You see? So the expression that he uses, Tzatka mimeni, she's more right than I am. Right? So the Medrash says that Yehuda only said Tzatka, she is right. I'm the one who caused her to be pregnant. But who said mimeni? So we normally learn Tzatka mimeni, that she's more right than I am, because I'm the guy that did this. So of course he can't kill her, and so on. But the Medrash says that the one who said mimeni was God, where God said, Yehuda said Tzatka, she's right. God said, mimeni, your desire to be with her was from me. I took away your free will. You had no choice. There was no way you could fight the Malach, right? Obviously, the Malach turned up his hormones, and that was the end of it, and finished. You see? So what do we see? Yehuda, that's the forerunner of Mashiach ben David, right? This is what he does. You see? Now, imagine until he found out that she was pregnant or whatever, he knew that he was with a woman, a prostitute. How do you think Yehuda felt all those months until he realized that she was expecting from somebody? Right? He knew what it was. He knew he was sin. He didn't know that God took away his free will. So he lived with the fact that he committed a sin for many months, obviously. Right? But wait a minute. What does that tell us? It means that somebody in the parsha of Mashiach can be forced to sin, even though it looks like a sin, but he can actually be forced to sin where he has no free will. Yet maybe he thinks that he did have free will, and he will now feel terrible that Yehuda, the neshama of Yehuda was awesome. Can you imagine what kind of a tzaddik and kodesh Yehuda, who's basically one of the greatest of the Shvatim. Can you imagine what he lived with, knowing that he was together with some prostitute, right? He didn't know God took away his free will, you see? So what do we see? That this is something that can be given to somebody who has the Yesod, basically, of Mashiach, Ben David. You see? So what that did is it can destroy his ruchnius. I mean, imagine some tzaddik, some famous tzaddik or some famous Rebbe that committed a terrible sin of what's called Hashkafa or Zima or whatever, immorality and so on. But he doesn't know that God took it away, the free will. Could you imagine the suffering that he would have with this person who has this type of neshama? So we begin to understand that there's a second dimension to the suffering of Mashiach ben Yosef. And he's not the only one, you see, but there's too much to speak about, and I will continue this shiur as part 2 later, next time. Thank you.